All right, thanks for tuning in to the channel today. Still have my debate going on with my Molinist friend in the comments, and we've been going back and forth and back and forth in the comments, and I can't rehash everything that's been established, but I think he's made some major concessions in his argument and some major clarifications as well. And so I originally had made a summative thoughts video. I thought we were at an impasse. I removed this video from my channel for now. We're not so much as at an impasse as we are just now clarifying a terminative point in his system. And I think he's made his position fairly clear now. And so I want to provide some points of clarification and respond to some of the claims that he's made. So I really appreciate your reply there if you're watching this video. Appreciate the continued discussion. For those of you that are just jumping on again, you can read the comments, you can watch the prior videos that we've made on this topic about Molinism, specifically with regards to the symmetrical dispositional grounding model that my interlocutor here is proposing. But let's start with some points of clarification. So I think, my interlocutor here has repeatedly stated that I am asking for a cause. And so, but this response misses my question. I don't need to ask for an antecedent cause in any of my questions. I can agree that a libertarian choice cannot have an antecedent sufficient cause that necessitates the choice. That is not my argument. There is the causal question: what antecedent event causes Peter to choose A? And then there's the grounding question: what makes the proposition Peter would choose A under C true rather than false? So when I phrased the question, perhaps I did this, why would Peter choose A under C? This is just me asking what makes the proposition Peter would choose A under C true. The question why is Peter would choose A under C true? That's just a question about what makes that proposition true, not necessarily about what temporally or causally determines Peter. I will try to avoid using the why formulation of the question if that's causing confusion, but please know that I am not looking for an antecedent event to give an explanation. I am looking for a grounding: what makes the proposition true. A truth maker need not be an antecedent deterministic event. So stating if something explained A rather than non-A, it would determine A, by you stating that on your part, that's not sufficient. When you state, quote, you're asking for a deterministic cause, end quote, this is somewhat question-begging. I'm not asking what event caused Peter's choice. I'm asking what makes the proposition would Peter choose A under C true rather than false. If your answer is that there is no further truth maker beyond Peter's primitive self-specifying agency, then say so, and I believe that's ultimately what you were saying. That is a substantive metaphysical commitment, but it's not a refutation of my question. And furthermore, I can say that you have demonstrated that a libertarian act cannot have an antecedent necessitating cause. That's not something you need to demonstrate to me. I can concede this point. But you have not demonstrated that a determinate contingent proposition therefore requires no truth maker beyond the agent's primitive self-specification. So another point of clarification. I'd prefer that we not shift the debate from the issues we have actually been discussing, which is ultimately the grounding of counterfactuals of creaturely freedoms. Let's not shift that to something else. In your last reply, you talk about a neurosurgeon and give an analogy there. That's trying to establish that libertarian freedom is necessary for ultimate moral responsibility. That may serve as a philosophical argument against compatibilism, but it doesn't establish, therefore, CCFs have determinate truth values prior to the decree. For the sake of argument, I can grant, suppose libertarian freedom is necessary for moral responsibility. I grant that Peter can possess an irreducible power to choose A or non-A. That gives you the could of our dialogue here. We're discussing could, would, and will. That gives you could. But your CCF, your counterfactual creaturely freedom, requires something more, i.e. a determinate truth that Peter would choose A rather than non-A under C. What makes the libertarian counterfactual true in Molinism or in your SDG model? We have just made it to the place where your position has been stated in significant clarity. Why at this point would we change to a different topic? If Molinism, your SDG variant of it, can establish that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom have determinate truth values prior to the decree, then I want to be convinced of that very fact. Convince me. My question was never and has never been, can libertarian agency be called primitive? Rather, it has been, what makes it true that Peter would choose A rather than non-A under C? And your answer is now, Peter's primitive self-specifying agency. And when I ask why that primitive agency has that particular counterfactual specification, you say that there is no further explanation because that would destroy libertarian freedom. You've answered the question. It's simply an answer I reject. The determinate counterfactual orientation is ultimately primitive and inexplicable. Okay, that's where the debate has progressed towards. Another point of clarification. In an earlier reply, you stated that for Reformed theology, the primitive is the divine decree. End quote. And you also objected that I too am holding to an ontological primitive because that is true for every metaphysical system. The Reformed position does not deny that God's free decree is ultimately underived, or primitive, if you wish for that term. We deny that the creature can possess an underived contingent determination prior to its creation. There's a categorical difference between an underived act of the necessary self-existent God and an underived contingent fact about a creature. Our argument is that the ontological order terminates in God. That's the Reformed position. And so our disagreement is now very precise. Where do we go from here? Your account terminates in a primitive, so where do we go? My primary point of contention is that I deny that calling the determinate counterfactual of creaturely freedom a primitive supplies a truth maker for it. It identifies the terminus of your explanation. It does not provide an explanation of why A, rather than non-A, is true. So let's go through some claims here. And I've kind of grouped these into similar claims under the same numeral and then added different letter designations after that as kind of subpoints or related claims. So claim 1A, you state that the matrix is the true matrix because God comprehends that Peter's haxeity under counterfactual dispositional stability resolves towards A and C. So let's just remove the technical terminology here. You were saying Peter would choose A under C because Peter's haxeity resolves toward A under C. In other words, Peter would choose A because Peter would choose A. The term disposition doesn't change the logical structure. In a video that I've temporarily removed from my channel because it was going to be my final video on this topic, but now it's no longer my final. In that video, I discussed the difference between explanation, stipulation, and redescription. An explanation tells us why P is true. Stipulation tells us that P is true. And a redescription tells us what P looks like using different terminology. The question remains, why does Peter's haxeity have a disposition toward A rather than non-A? And you claim because that's its formal identity. That simply makes the determinate orientation constitutive of the primitive. That's a legitimate stopping point if you want to stop there. Claims 1B and 1C. You state that the dispositional profile of an uncreated exemplar is an ultimate formal primitive within the divine intellect, and also that Peter's haxeity is the exemplar of a free agent whose formal identity includes an uncoerced contingent self-specification. So you've moved the counterfactual of creaturely freedom into Peter's essence here. So the question I have is, Peter's would choose A under C essential to Peter or not? If so, then the counterfactual of creaturely freedom is constitutive of Peter's formal identity. And therefore, Peter's choosing A under C isn't merely something Peter does. It is something constitutive of what Peter is. Let me state that again. Peter's choosing A under C isn't merely something Peter does if you want to maintain that the CCF is constitutive of Peter's formal identity. Rather, it's something constitutive of what Peter is. This seems to be against libertarian contingency. Now, Peter under C, therefore A, is built into the very formal identity of Peter. If you say, but Peter could choose non-A, well, then could Peter have had exactly the same hexady and yet chosen non-A under C? If so, then the CCF isn't actually constitutive of his hexady. And if not, then the CCF is essential to his identity, and the counterfactual is no longer genuinely contingent in the relevant sense. And let me push a little further here. Is the A orientation, we're talking about Peter would A under C, is the A orientation necessarily constitutive of Peter's formal identity or contingently so? If necessary, then a differently disposed individual simply wouldn't be Peter, but some distinct essence Peter. Okay, then saying that's its formal identity is a legitimate terminus, structurally like why does a triangle have three sides? But you pay for that legitimacy immediately because it makes Peter would A in C true in every possible world containing that essence, given C. And that's not the contingency libertarian freedom requires. And it's not even what Molinism itself needs. Molina invented middle knowledge precisely to secure contingent would counterfactuals, not de re necessary ones. You've bought a valid terminus by paying with the very feature, that is contingency, that your whole system was designed and exists to protect. Molina's counterfactual creaturely freedom is supposed to be contingent truth, not merely a necessary truth about a particular essence. Remember our question. Is the A orientation necessarily constitutive of Peter's formal identity or contingently so? If it's contingently so, the identical formal identity is compossible with non-A. Then you haven't explained anything because the same identity, ex hypothesis, was equally available to resolve the other way. Because that's its formal identity, just reasserts that it resolved toward A, it doesn't say why. To say that, quote, necessarily, if disposition toward A is constitutive of Peter's formal identity, then Peter would A in C is true only as a necessity of the consequence. And that's not something you said, but that's ultimately what your system is promoting here. To say that, let me say it one more time. Necessarily, if disposition toward A is constitutive of Peter's formal identity, then Peter would A in C is true only as a necessity of the consequence. Okay, but this is a trivial analytic conditional nobody disputes. That tells me nothing about whether the antecedent obtains and that, whether the identity in fact includes this feature and why. It's not a necessity of the consequent. This tells me nothing about whether the antecedent obtains and that it is not a necessity of the consequent. It's the whole contingent, unconditioned claim in dispute. So your answer borrows the self-evidence that belongs to the trivial conditional, the necessity of the consequence, and it quietly spins it on the substantive categorical claim that was never established. Okay, in other words, if Peter's essence necessarily includes disposition X, and X necessarily entails A under C, then necessarily, if Peter has X and C obtains, A follows. But that does not establish necessarily Peter has X. See how we're distinguishing here between necessity of the consequence and the consequent there. And a third time, just to make it very clear what I'm charging you with, you have established at most that if Peter's formal identity includes an A-directed disposition, then A follows from that disposition under C. But the disputed question is precisely why Peter's formal identity has that particular contingent disposition rather than its contrary. Even granting your formal identity language, you must distinguish that by which something is known or individuated from that by which it is made true. You have to distinguish, even if I grant your formal identity language, between that by which something is known or individuated from that by which it is made true. At best, formal identity identifies which possible complete biography counts as Peter's. Individuation is not truth-making. You owe me the second, the truth-making, and you've supplied at most the first, haxeity. And there are three, different questions here. And I think that the symmetrical dispositional grounding model that you're proposing repeatedly moves between them. On the one hand, you have one, who is Peter. This is answered by haxeity and formal identity. Two, what can Peter do? Well, this is answered by his contrary powers, his capabilities, his capacities. And three, why is it true that Peter would do A rather than non-A under C? This is the counterfactual of creaturely freedom truth-making question. Your appeals to haxeity answer 1, who is Peter? And your appeal to agentive power answers 2, what can Peter do? Neither answers 3, why is it true that Peter would do A rather than non-A under C? By stating that Peter's haxeity contains his dispositional profile, then if Peter's disposition toward A under C is necessary to Peter's formal identity, then Peter would A under C becomes necessary wherever Peter exists under C. That is not the contingent counterfactual Molinism needs. If it is contingent with respect to Peter's formal identity, then Peter's identity is compatible with both A and non-A. But then saying A is Peter's formal identity no longer explains why A rather than non-A is true. You've simply identified the subject to which the unexplained contingent property belongs. And again, individuation is not truth-making. Haxeity answers which individual. It does not automatically answer which contingent counterfactual is true of that individual. Okay, related here, 1D and bringing back 1B again. You state Peter's haxeity never existed as a blank slate that later acquired a disposition. And again, 1B, the dispositional profile of an uncreated exemplar is an ultimate formal primitive within the divine intellect. Okay, so you should distinguish Peter's identity from Peter's contingent actions. Suppose Peter's haxeity is this particular individual Peter, and C is Peter is in the courtyard. That's our circumstance. And A is that Peter confesses Christ, and non-A is that Peter denies Christ. Or you can switch those, it doesn't matter. A could be that Peter denies Christ, and not A or non-A is Peter confesses Christ. The following propositions are not equivalent. 1, Peter is Peter. 2, Peter has the power to choose A or non-A. 3, Peter would choose A if C. The first concerns identity, the second concerns capacity, the third concerns the specific contingent counterfactual determination. Your entire argument seems to move from 1 and 2 to 3 without explaining the transition. So how does Peter, as a divine exemplar, contain the truth of Peter would choose A under C without that truth either being 1, necessary, 2, being grounded in God's will, or 3, being an unexplained contingent primitive? You cannot simply answer because that's Peter's haxeity, because that is just replacing Peter would choose A with Peter's haxeity includes choosing A. All you've done is renamed the explanandum. This is redescription. Redescription is not the same thing as explanation. See what I've said earlier in the video. Okay, moving to claim 2. You state, just as nothing calls the number 7 to be prime, nothing calls Peter's haxeity to have its formal identity. This comparison, this analogy is highly problematic. You're dealing with something that is necessary, and you even concede this point in your reply, so why bring it up? The only parallel seems to be that neither necessary internal relations of numbers, nor Peter's haxeity having its formal identity are caused. 7 being a prime number is necessary. 7 is prime is a necessary truth. When you state that 7 is prime, that is a necessary truth. Whereas Peter would choose A under C is supposed to be contingent. Peter would choose A under C is supposed to be a contingent truth. The whole difficulty is precisely that you are trying to put a contingent counterfactual of creaturely freedom into the same ontological category as necessary mathematical relations. Nobody's debating on the YouTube comments what makes the statement 7 is a prime number true. 7 is prime doesn't need a contingent truth maker because it is a necessary truth. The Molinist counterfactual of creaturely freedom is supposed to be not necessary, not actual. not decretively determined, yet definitely true. You cannot simply assimilate the two cases between prime numbers and the Molinist counterfactual creaturely freedom. The very thing requiring explanation is why this contingent formal identity of Peter is A rather than non-A. And also, please remember that I am not asking for an antecedent caused. You said caused the number 7 to be prime. I'm not looking for an antecedent event to give an explanation. I'm looking for a grounding. What makes the proposition true? A truth maker need not be an antecedent deterministic event. So my question, is Peter would choose A under C necessary in the same sense that 7 is prime is necessary? If yes, then you've lost the contingency of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom. If not, again, if Peter would choose A under C is not necessary in the same sense that 7 is prime is necessary, then the analogy with 7 is prime fails, and we return to the question, what accounts for its contingent specification? Note that here, I'm not demanding deterministic causation. Here, I am simply distinguishing 1, necessary uncaused truth from 2, contingent uncaused truth. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about, on the one hand, necessary uncaused truth, and on the other, contingent uncaused truth. Classical theism has no difficulty with the former, number 1, necessary uncaused truth, like 7 is prime. My objection is about the latter, number 2, contingent uncaused truth. Is Peter's determinate orientation toward A under C necessary in the same way that 7's primality is necessary? If yes, then you've sacrificed the contingency of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom, and if not, then the mathematical analogy is irrelevant to the grounding problem. Claim 3, A. You state that Peter's exemplar is necessary, uncreated, eternal forms known via God's natural knowledge. That is not enough to establish the counterfactual of creaturely freedom. Classical divine exemplarism gives God's knowledge of the divine ideas and exemplars of creatures, but there's a major difference between, on the one hand, 1, what God knows what Peter is, and 2, God knows what Peter would freely do under a counterfactual circumstance. The former, 1, that God knows what Peter is, that's an account of creaturely possibility in nature. The latter, that God knows what Peter would freely do under a counterfactual, that latter is a claim about a contingent free act. So we are back at where in the exemplar is the determinate counterfactual creaturely freedom located. If it is located in A, Peter as a rational agent is capable of A and non-A, then that gives us could, i.e. possibility. If it is located in B, Peter is a rational agent who would A under C, then you have simply put the counterfactual creaturely freedom into the exemplar and made the determined orientation primitive. Divine exemplarism does not automatically give Molinism, or your SDG model variety of Molinism. You need an additional argument explaining why God's exemplar of Peter contains the determinate truth of Peter's hypothetical libertarian actions. To call the source of grounding formal, structural, dispositional, exemplaristic, or conceptual does not answer the question of its ontological origin. It changes the vocabulary describing the ground without identifying what ultimately makes A true rather than non-A. 3b. Saying that Peter's hexaity, and this is your quote, you're saying that it is uncreated eternal forms, and then you compare it to mathematical entities. You need to distinguish, on the one hand, 1, God's eternal idea of Peter, from 2, an eternally existing Peter essence that possesses determinate contingent properties. Classical theism can argue that God eternally knows the creature he will create. It does not follow that the creature's contingent properties therefore exist eternally as independent determinate realities. If the counterfactual of creaturely freedom is eternally true because Peter's exemplar eternally contains Peter would choose A under C, then you need to explain the ontological status of that contingent determination. You cannot simply say it is in God's intellect. That's where it is known, and you're giving an answer regarding the location. My question is, why is it true? Well, let's dive a little bit deeper on this. Consider these 3 questions and how your system answers them. 1, where is the counterfactual of creaturely freedom known? In God's eternal intellect? 2, or no, that is where it's known. I didn't mean to phrase that as a question. Where is the counterfactual of creaturely freedom known? Your system answers in God's eternal intellect. 2, what represents the counterfactual of creaturely freedom? Well, this is Peter's divine exemplar and haxeity. And then 3, why is the counterfactual of creaturely freedom true? Well, because Peter's primitive agency has that determinate self-specifying orientation. Those are 3 questions, and those are 3 answers that your system gives. The CCF is known in God's eternal intellect. The CCF is represented in Peter's divine exemplar and haxeity. The CCF is true because Peter's primitive agency has that determinate self-specifying orientation. And please quit running these 3 questions together going forward. There is the epistemological location of the counterfactual creaturely freedom, which is 1. We just discussed that under point 1. There is its representation in divine conceptualism, that's point 2. And then there is its ontological ground, 3. You have answered the first 2, and my objection concerns the third. So quit going back over 1 and 2. You now say that this determinate orientation is itself primitive and that it serves as the ontological ground, 3. And so then primitive agency, though, is doing 2 different jobs. On the one hand, you have primitive power, which is basically that Peter has the power for A or non-A. And then you have primitive specification, whereby this is Peter's power that is counterfactually specified toward A rather than non-A under C. I have no objection to primitive agency being primitive power. My question and objections concerned primitive agency being used as primitive specification. And it seems like you want to kind of equivocate on these 2 things, make primitive agency cover both simultaneously. And just to be super clear on this, if primitive specification is primitive in your system, then you have not supplied a further explanation of why the counterfactual of creaturely freedom is true. You have located the ultimate ground of that contingent truth in Peter's primitive agency, meaning Peter's primitive specification of that agency. And that may be a legitimate philosophical position, but it's precisely the point at issue. All right, claim 4. You state that the contingency originates in the formal nature of creaturely secondary agency. Okay, so that's precisely what needs demonstration. A creature having secondary causal power does not entail that the creature is the ultimate source of contingent specification. Your argument requires that Peter must be the ultimate source of the determinate counterfactual specification of his action, but that does not follow merely from Peter being a genuine secondary cause. The statement that the CCF is contingently specified by Peter's secondary agency, that sounds plausible because it combines 2 true-sounding concepts. On the one hand, 1, creaturely agency is contingent, and on the other hand, 2, Peter is a secondary cause. But the question is when and in what sense Peter's agency performs this specification. Ordinarily, secondary agency belongs to an actual creature. Peter doesn't exercise secondary causality merely by being an idea in God's intellect. Is Peter's secondary agency an actual ontological agent before Peter exists, or is it merely represented by God in the divine exemplar? If it is actual agency, you've seemingly made Peter's creaturely agency eternal and uncreated. If it is merely represented in the divine intellect, the divine idea represents a creature who could choose A, but you've again presupposed the very counterfactual of creaturely freedom you're trying to ground. And this is the circularity in a slightly different form. You claim that Peter's agency grounds the counterfactual of creaturely freedom. However, before Peter exists, what is available to God is God's idea of Peter. Therefore, God's idea of Peter must somehow contain Peter's determinative agency, or determinate agency. But what determines the content of that idea? Well, your answer seems to be Peter's determinate agency. And that's exactly the bridge that you've not really explained, and the circle you've not really broken out of. All right, claim 5. You critique classical Molinism at one point in one of your replies, and you state that because in it the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are brute contingent truths external to God, and so you claim that in your SDG model, your symmetrical dispositional grounding model, that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are not brute because they are grounded in divine conceptualism. But then you simultaneously say that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are contingently specified by Peter's primitive secondary agency. So what does grounded in divine conceptualism actually mean? Does it mean, 1, that divine conceptualism makes the counterfactual of creaturely freedom true? then God's intellect is the ground of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom. But then why isn't God determining the counterfactual in that system? You need to explain how God's conceptualization constitutes the truth of Peter would choose A without God thereby being responsible for the truth of A rather than non-A. And that's precisely what Molinism traditionally wants to avoid. 2, maybe Peter's primitive agency makes the counterfactual of creaturely freedom true. Then the counterfactual of creaturely freedom, the CCF, isn't grounded in divine conceptualism in the strong sense. God's intellect knows the CCF because it comprehends Peter's primitive agency. But then you're basically back at Peter's contingent disposition, which then leads to the CCF, which then leads to divine knowledge. We're talking about logical relationships here. And my original question remains, what gives Peter's primitive agency this particular contingent specification? You have explicitly said at this point nothing further, it is primitive. So you haven't distinguished your position from classical Molinism because you haven't eliminated the brute contingency. You've relocated it and maybe even renamed it primitive. And then consider 3, maybe the matrix itself makes it true. And then I ask you, why is the A matrix true rather than the non-A matrix? And we've already gone around that circle. So the phrase grounded in divine conceptualism appears to be doing ambiguous work. It can mean God has an eternal concept, an exemplar of Peter, or it can mean God's conceptualization grounds the truth of Peter's counterfactual. And those are very different claims, though. The first is compatible with the classical divine exemplarism. The second is exactly what needs to be demonstrated. And you repeatedly say that the counterfactual of creaturely freedom is in the divine intellect. But where God knows a proposition is not ontological ground. Your language has become confusing here if we are moving from what grounds the CCF to where does God know the CCF. Your model establishes the epistemic location of the CCF, but I'm asking about its ontological ground. You appeal to divine conceptualism, your appeal to divine conceptualism appears to give you what your model needs, but only if you quietly change what divine conceptualism means. Classical divine conceptualism can say something like, created possibilities have their intelligible exemplars in God's intellect. But the controversial Molinist proposition is there is an eternally determinate contingent truth about what a libertarian creature would freely choose in a circumstance that God has not decreed. Those are not equivalent. I can grant, on the one hand, 1, God eternally knows Peter as a possible creature. 2, God eternally knows every power Peter would possess if created. And 3, God eternally knows every logical possible circumstance involving Peter. But you still haven't established Peter would choose A rather than non-A under C. Divine exemplarism can explain the divine idea of Peter without thereby explaining the truth of a particular CCF concerning Peter. To say that the particular CCF is included in the exemplar doesn't solve anything. Why is that particular contingent CCF included rather than its contrary? And we're back at the bedrock of our disagreement. All right, moving on to claim 6. I think ultimately your use of primitive relies on ambiguity. I think that you are using primitive in at least 2 different senses, and maybe even 3. I discussed this a little bit later in this video. But in one sense, you're using primitive as ontologically irreducible. So, agent causation cannot be reduced to event causation. Okay. But on the other hand, 2, you're using primitive as an explanatorily ultimate. You're using primitive as explanatorily ultimate. In other words, there is no further answer to why Peter's agency is specified toward A rather than non-A. And that point 2 is a much stronger claim. Rather than saying a primitive is ontologically irreducible, 2, Peter, or a primitive as an explanatorily ultimate, that is a much stronger claim. The first does not entail the second. I have no objection to agent causal power being primitive in the sense that it is not reducible to prior event causation. But you appear to be making a stronger claim, and that is that the particular contingent counterfactual specification of that power is itself explanatorily ultimate. And if so, please distinguish those claims. I'm asking whether irreducibility of agency entails irreducibly of a particular counterfactual truth. It doesn't obviously do so. And underneath all of this terminology you employ, you need 1, a necessary divine exemplar, 2, Peter as a particular possible free agent, 3, Peter's determinate contingent dispositional orientation, 4, the counterfactual crucially freedom Peter would A under C, and 5, God knows that counterfactual crucially freedom prior to the decree. The disputed step here is between 2 and 3. Peter's a particular possible free agent, and Peter's determinate contingent dispositional orientation. Peter as a possible free agent and his determinate contingent orientation toward A. There's a gap there, and that's the disputed step between those. Your answer is primitive self-specifying agency, so that when I ask why A rather than non-A is true, it is because that's the primitive specification of Peter's agency. That's the actual metaphysical disagreement we have. Everything else, the symmetrical dispositional grounding, structural realism, quantum entanglement, relational matrices, divine exemplarism, haxeity, formal conceptualization, all of that is downstream of that core disagreement. And so what your position wants to hold together is that on the one hand, 1, Peter doesn't yet exist. 2, Peter's exemplar eternally exists in God's intellect. 3, the exemplar contains a determinate contingent disposition. 4, that disposition is not caused by God. 5, it is not necessary. 6, it is not discovered from an external existent. 7, it is nevertheless eternally true. And 8, God knows it through his own intellect. So what is the ontological status of this determinate feature of Peter's exemplar? What is the ontological status of this contingent determinate feature of Peter's exemplar? If you say it is 1, necessary, then it isn't contingent. And if you say it is 2, God's will, then you've moved toward the reform position. If you say it is 3, something outside of God, divine conceptualism and aseity becomes problematic. If you say 4, it is a contingent feature of the divine exemplar that is neither caused by God nor external to God, then what exactly does that mean? But I think you would say 5, it is simply a primitive feature of Peter's self-specifying agency. That's the ontological status of this contingent determinate feature of Peter's exemplar. It's simply a primitive feature of Peter's self-specifying agency. Okay, well then the ultimate source of this contingent specification is not God's will, but the creature's primitive counterfactual agency. And that's precisely the metaphysical commitment I've been asking you to identify. So this does, though, seem to be in significant tension, if not outright contradictory, with another claim you have made. You stated that, quote, in terms of ontological status within the divine intellect, Peter's uncreated exemplar, haxeity, exists similarly to how mathematical entities exist as necessary, uncaused, eternal forms known via God's natural knowledge. Okay, that's your quote. Your language seems to oscillate between answers that cannot all be maintained simultaneously. The status of Peter's haxeity is doing contradictory work in your SDG model. Let's look at the claims you've made. 1, Peter's haxeity is an eternal, uncreated exemplar in the divine intellect. 2, it exists similarly to mathematical entities as a necessary, uncaused eternal form. 3, Peter's haxeity contains a determinate dispositional orientation toward A under C. 4, that orientation is contingent, not necessary. 5, the orientation is not determined by God's will. 6, it is nevertheless known eternally by God through his own intellect. And 7, it is ultimately grounded in Peter's primitive secondary agency. The problem is that you are moving between at least 3 different senses of Peter's haxeity. And these are, 1, haxeity as a necessary divine exemplar. And if by haxeity you mean something like God's necessary idea of this particular possible creature, Peter, then it can explain why God knows who Peter could be, but it does not follow that it contains Peter would freely choose A rather than non-A under C. The latter is contingent. Okay, and here's the other sense of Peter's haxeity that you're moving between. You're using it, haxaity, as contingent dispositional profile. And you add, and I'm quoting, Peter's haxaity contains the determinate disposition toward A under C. You have added something contingent to the necessary exemplar. And now the question becomes, in what sense is the contingent specification part of a necessary eternal exemplar? If the specification is necessary because it belongs to the exemplar necessarily, then the CCF isn't contingent in the relevant sense. If the specification is contingent, then its contingency needs an account. Your answer is Peter's primitive agency. But then we haven't learned how a contingent feature of creaturely agency becomes a constituent of an eternal, necessary divine exemplar. This is the gap you need to explain. And see my comments on the number 7 earlier in this video, being, the number 7 being prime, and that analogy you use. Rewind the video and look at that. And I think you're moving between 2 to 3 senses of primitive. Primitive agency or power, primitive counterfactual specification or disposition, and primitive exemplar. I can grant number 1 here, primitive agency or power, without granting the primitive counterfactual specification or disposition. Peter's primitive power explains why he is genuinely capable of A or non-A. And the Molinist counterfactual of creaturely freedom requires something more. That is, that one of those alternatives is eternally and infallibly true as a counterfactual. If that determinate specification is itself primitive, then you have not eliminated the ultimate contingent primitive of classical Molinism. You have relocated it into Peter's eternally comprehended exemplar. Okay, you've not really moved away from classical Molinism, though. All right, you appear to move between 3 different primitives: power, disposition, and determinate counterfactual orientation. They cannot simply be treated as equivalent. A primitive power gives me could. A determinate primitive disposition gives me something closer to would, but then the determinate disposition itself requires explanation. And an exemplar containing the determinate disposition merely relocates the question from the creature to the divine idea. What is the ontological status of the contingent determinate specification of Peter's non-existent agency that makes the counterfactual of creaturely freedom true? All right, your answer is, it is simply a primitive feature of Peter's agency. Okay, then I think we have reached the bedrock disagreement. The Reformed account ultimately locates contingent actuality in God's will, and your SDG model locates a determinate contingent counterfactual truth in creaturely agency prior to the creature's existence and prior to God's decree. I think that difference has significant consequences for divine aseity, providence, and the creator-creature distinction. And there are 2 separate questions that your account needs to distinguish. And I've stated it already. First, what is the ontological status of the determinate counterfactual creaturely freedom? You describe Peter's haxaity as an eternal, uncreated, necessary exemplar in the divine intellect, analogous to necessary mathematical entities, but you also say that the determinate orientation of that exemplar toward A rather than non-A is contingent and ultimately grounded in Peter's primitive secondary agency. I don't yet see how those claims cohere. A necessary exemplar can certainly represent a possible creature and its powers, but a contingent determination of what that creature would freely do is not thereby made necessary, nor is it explained merely by being included in the exemplar. And second, what does it mean to say that divine conceptualism grounds the counterfactual of creaturely freedom? If you mean that God eternally knows the CCF by comprehending his exemplar of Peter, then you have given me the epistemic location of the CCF, not its ontological ground. The question remains what makes Peter would A under C true rather than Peter would non-A under C. If the answer is Peter's primitive agency, then the ultimate ground of the determinate CCF is creaturely rather than divine. If the answer is God's conceptualization, then I need to know in what sense God's conceptualization makes the CCF true without determining it. Simply saying that the CCF is inside the divine intellect does not resolve that distinction. In sum, we should call the disagreement between us what it is. You locate ultimate contingent determination in a creaturely primitive. I deny that a creature can be the ultimate ground of a determinate contingent truth prior to its existence. Our disagreement is whether Peter can be the ultimate ground of a determinate contingent truth concerning Peter before Peter exists, and whether making that truth an eternal object of God's pre-volitional knowledge is compatible with divine aseity. I would like to discuss further whether your account, this SDG model, where the determinate CCF is a primitive, I'd like to discuss whether that model is compatible with divine aseity. Does God determine the truth of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom? The model you are promoting says no. Well, then, does the truth of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom ultimately depend upon a determinate feature of creaturely agency? Your model says yes. Is that determinate feature grounded in God's will? Your model says no. And there is therefore a contingent determination whose ultimate ground is not God's will, but which God eternally knows and upon which his choice of a world is informed. The ultimate source of this particular contingent truth, Peter would ANC, is not God. That's the aseity issue. The issue is not temporal epistemic dependence. God does not learn anything from Peter. The issue is ontological dependence in the content of divine cognition. At this point, I'm asking whether the determinate content of God's eternal pre-volitional knowledge ultimately originates in God or in something other than God. You have answered that it originates in Peter's primitive self-specifying agency, not in God's decree, and that is precisely the claim that I contest. Peter does not yet exist. Nevertheless, according to symmetrical dispositional grounding, there is already an eternally determinate contingent fact about what this non-existent creature would freely do. God did not decree it, and you do not regard it as necessary. Yet, God's eternal knowledge contains it, and God's decree takes it into account. Suppose that God's eternal knowledge contains the counterfactual of creaturely freedom if C, Peter would choose A. But according to your SDG model, the truth of that proposition ultimately depends upon Peter's primitive self-specifying agency. Yet Peter is not the ultimate explanatory source of his own existence, nature, or place in creation. His entire being is derivative from God. So you have an interesting inversion here. Under classical theism, you have 1, God, 2, Peter's being powers, 3, Peter's contingent action, and that in that order, logically, God, then logically Peter's being and powers, and then Peter's contingent action. Under the SDG model you're promoting, you start with 1, Peter's primitive counterfactual specification, 2, the truth of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom, 3, the content of God's eternal middle knowledge, and 4, God's decree takes that CCF into account. And that raises the aseity question. How can something ontologically derivative from God nevertheless possess, prior to its existence and independently of God's decree, a determinate contingent specification that conditions the content of God's eternal knowledge? Let me state it one more time. Let me copy and paste it here from my notes here. I worked up to type this up for like a whole day. Let me just paste this in here. All right. How can something ontologically derivative from God nevertheless possess, prior to its existence and independently of God's decree, a determinate contingent specification that conditions the content of God's eternal knowledge? Without running after extraneous issues, our debate centers now on 2 questions. 1, whether your primitive really explains anything, and 2, what it means for classical divine aseity. I've already dealt with 1. Let's now focus on 2 here, and maybe we'll circle back to 1 and how that ties in at the end of the video. All right, let's focus on 2. What does this mean for classical divine aseity? Aseity classically means not merely that God's existence depends on nothing else, but that nothing about God, including the determinate content of what he eternally knows or wills, is received, conditioned, or specified from outside himself. God is the sole terminus of explanation for everything other than himself, and receives nothing in any respect from what he causes or comprehends. The charge is here. Content dependence, not temporal dependence. You cannot escape by combating a charge that I haven't made. You can point out that God doesn't wait on or learn from Peter. This is true and irrelevant. Again, the problem is not temporal dependence, causal dependence, or epistemic learning. The problem is ontological dependence of the determinate content of divine cognition. And the argument then is this: whatever fixes the determinate content of an item in God's knowledge beyond what mere possibility supplies must trace either to God's own essence, natural knowledge of possibilities, or to God's own will, free knowledge, post-decree. Or rather, to state it more specifically, tailored to our discussion, within the classical divine knowledge framework we have been discussing, the determinate content of God's knowledge must ultimately be grounded either in what is necessary by God's nature or what God freely wills and decrees. You seem to deny both because you deny the counterfactual creaturely freedom, is necessary. That would make it natural knowledge. And you deny that it is decreed. The whole point of a counterfactual creaturely freedom's logical priority is that it conditions the decree rather than being fixed by it. So on your account, this content is grounded in neither of the only two sources divine aseity permits. There is no third source available, because nothing exists ontologically distinct from God prior to his own will. And that is, your counterfactual creaturely freedom is neither necessary nor decreed. So what is the third ontological source of its determinate truth? Your recent concession here is actually very useful. You state that the ultimate locus of contingency is indeed located in the creaturely agent's primitive, self-specifying identity as eternally known by God. God doesn't determine the counterfactual creaturely freedom. Peter's primitive agency determines and specifies it. God eternally knows it, and God decrees in light of it. There's an independent metaphysical reason, though, that Peter specifically cannot supply a third source. In classical metaphysics, every creature is really distinct from its own act of existing. Only God is his own esse, his own existence. Prior to any decree, Peter has no actuality of his own whatsoever, not even a diminished, self-standing possible existence, since his status as an object of thought is constituted by, not independent of, God's comprehending intellect. And let me qualify here. You will say Peter has a possible or intentional being in God's intellect. But the point is, Peter has no actuality of his own from which he can exercise grounding power. Or to qualify again, prior to God's decree, Peter does not possess actual existence or an actual exercise of agency. Whatever Peter exists at that point exists as a possible creature, according to God's knowledge. Therefore, the question is not whether God can eternally know Peter's possible essence. Classical theism absolutely affirms that. The question is whether the specific contingent exercise of Peter's non-existent agency can already constitute the truth maker for a proposition God knows, prior to God willing, Peter's existence. I grant that God can eternally know the possible Peter. I deny that this entails that the possible Peter supplies the determinate, contingent, counterfactual creaturely freedom. So there are two scholastic axioms that your own vocabulary already presupposes that do the rest. Agere sequitur esse. A thing's power to act, ground, or determine anything is proportioned to its own actuality. And nemo dat quod non habet. Nothing confers what it does not possess. Peter, pre-decree, possesses no actuality of his own to confer. He cannot be the ground of anything, including a determinate truth about himself, because grounding is an act, and he has at that point nothing to act with. I can hear the objection now. You want to maintain that the ground isn't efficient causal, but merely formal, a feature of the possible essence Peter as an object of the divine intellect. The way triangle formally includes three-sided, with no causal action required, or the way the number 7 is prime. Okay, whose actuality is doing the comprehending? The idea of Peter as comprehended is an act of God's intellect. Whatever or whatever actuality that act has belongs to God, not to a Peter standing outside of it. If the specific content of that idea, A rather than non-A, nonetheless traces to Peter rather than to God's own comprehending activity, you've relocated the foreign contribution from the causal register to the cognitive one, not removed it. You're now claiming that within an act of thought that is entirely God's own, some of the content is supplied by something other than God. And this is the same aseity problem, one register over. To state this another way, to avoid your objection that you are not saying Peter efficiently causes anything. All right, let's state it another way. A non-existent creature cannot exercise the causal or, look at this, grounding agency that you are assigning to it. If Peter's agency is not actual agency, what exactly is doing the grounding? You must say that the formal exemplar of Peter's agency grounds it. Well, then you're back to your original problem of where did the exemplar get its determinate A orientation? To which you reply, that's simply its formal identity. Okay, then either that A orientation is necessary to the exemplar or contingent, and we're back to the dilemma. If you want to maintain that the would counterfactual, Peter would A and C, if you want to argue that that would counterfactual becomes a necessary feature of a merely possible essence, fully at home in God's natural knowledge with no third source needed, keeping divine aseity intact, okay, what is the consequence of this move? Well, then the determinacy of Peter's actual life comes entirely from one of the available necessary essence profiles. Peter would A versus the distinct possible individual Peter would not A. And that determinacy of Peter's actual life comes from the available necessary essence profiles that God selects for instantiation. And that selection is decree. SDG, your symmetrical dispositional grounding model, has quietly become my view in new vocabulary, and middle knowledge has collapsed into natural knowledge plus the decree. This is exactly the collapse that Molina invented the third category of middle knowledge to prevent. If you want to maintain the opposite horn of this dilemma, to keep your SDG model distinctive, i.e., you want to say that the would counterfactual Peter would A and C is contingent, okay, then the formal identity explains nothing. Using basic logic or definitions does not explain why this specific event happens. Per divine aseity, nothing exists per divine aseity, nothing else exists prior to the decree. It's not natural knowledge, which by hypothesis undermines this specific content, and not divine will, which by hypothesis has not acted, capable of supplying it. The truth of the counterfactual isn't merely primitive at that point, it's fixed by nothing that exists at all. It means the truth relies on literally nothing. Okay, well, let me qualify that. If you deny that the determinate counterfactual creaturely freedom is grounded in God's essence or will, and you also deny that it is grounded in an actual creature, then you have identified no ontological ground for its determinate truth. You may call that a primitive if you wish, but the explanatory work is ended here. You've already admitted that the symmetrical dispositional grounding model bites the bullet on the ultimate locus of contingency is indeed located in the creaturely agent's primitive self-specifying identity. In conceding this, you have not supplied a ground, and your own classical theist commitments make the available candidates problematic. All right, we're going to get to that trilemma in a second. Your symmetrical dispositional grounding model depends on you being able to slide between different uses of the terms aseity, primitive, and exemplars. And it also depends on you being able to slide between different senses of Peter's disposition, being on the one hand necessary and on the other hand contingent. Which sense of these words you are using ultimately depends on which objection to Molinism you are trying to defeat. This is ultimately fatal to your model since you must change the ontological role of the same term depending on which problem you are answering, without explaining how those senses are related. The difficulty with your model that has become increasingly apparent throughout this exchange is that symmetrical dispositional grounding appears to depend upon equivocation between several different senses of haxeity, exemplar, primitive, and disposition. In saying this, I do not mean that these terms cannot have multiple legitimate senses. Of course they can. My concern is that the sense required to answer one objection creates the problem answered by another. Okay, let's consider haxeity. When you appeal to Peter's haxeity to establish his identity across possible worlds, it functions as an individuating principle. It answers who Peter is. But when you appeal to Peter's haxeity as the ground of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom, it must do considerably more. It must contain or ground the contingent fact that Peter would choose A under C rather than on A. And those are not the same explanatory function. Individuation does not automatically provide truth-making. All right, let's consider exemplar again. When you appeal to divine exemplarism in its classical sense, the divine idea explains the intelligible and formal possibility of a creature God may create. That is perfectly intelligible within classical theism. But when the exemplar is said to contain the determinate when the exemplar is said to contain the determinate contingent fact that Peter would freely choose A under C, the exemplar has acquired a new function. It now somehow contains a specific contingent counterfactual of creaturely agency. And that is precisely what needs to be established, not assumed. Consider the term primitive. At some points, the primitive seems to be Peter's irreducible power of contrary choice. Peter can choose A or not A. I grant that, but that gives us could, not would. At other points, the primitive seems to be a determinate dispositional orientation. Peter would choose A under C, but that is the very contingent specification whose truth I've been asking you to ground, and still at other points, the primitive seems to be the formal identity of Peter's exemplar. But then we have to ask whether the A orientation is necessary to that formal identity or contingent with respect to it. And let me just put this term on here too. Well, I'm editing my slides live. Disposition. Okay. Consider disposition. If Peter's A-directed disposition is necessary to his formal identity, then given C, the counterfactual creaturely freedom becomes necessary rather than contingently true. You've preserved a ground by sacrificing the contingency Molinism requires. If the A-directed disposition is contingent, then Peter's formal identity is equally compatible with an A-directed and a non-A-directed disposition. In that case, saying A is Peter's disposition simply tells me which disposition he has. It does not explain why this contingent disposition obtains rather than its contrary. And so the issue is deeper than terminology. The model repeatedly needs a term to perform two incompatible explanatory jobs. The haxeity must be necessary enough to provide an objective ground, but contingent enough to preserve libertarian contingency. The exemplar must be necessary and eternally grounded in God, but must contain a contingent specification not supplied by God's necessary nature or will. The primitive must be determinate enough to explain would, but indeterminate enough to preserve could do otherwise. And that's the tension I want you to resolve in your model. I'm not objecting to the words themselves or the concepts you're using. I'm asking whether there is a single coherent ontological account underneath them. The deepest problem with your model can be expressed in a three-way tension. Another trilemma here. If the determinate A orientation is 1. Necessary to Peter's essence, it cannot supply the contingent counterfactual creaturely freedom Molinism requires. If it is 2. Contingent but grounded in God, it ultimately comes from God's essence or will, threatening to collapse middle knowledge into natural and free knowledge, or natural or free knowledge, or both. And then 3, contingent and not grounded in God. If the determinate A orientation is contingent and not grounded in God, well then symmetrical dispositional grounding has located an ultimate contingent truth in the creature exemplar independently of God's will, raising the aseity problem. And your response so far seems to be it is a primitive feature of Peter's agency. But that isn't a fourth option in the relevant sense. It is a decision to terminate the explanation actually at point 3 here. And that's an important distinction. Calling something primitive doesn't make it necessary. It means you have declared it to be an explanatory terminus. The trilemma I oppose here is a closed disjunction on modal status. You either have necessary or contingent. Those are the two modes. And this is crossed with a closed disjunction on source. It's either grounded in God or not. And nothing you've said so far falls outside of this. However, perhaps the fourth option you will claim is joint or relational grounding, not creaturely, not purely divine, but co-constituted. And this might be the natural next move that you can make because it's continuous with vocabulary you've already used. You've spoken of a co-conditioning matrix, a formally co-constitutive single truth. So you'll say that my trilemma is a false trichotomy because it assumes the source must be either God or the creature. When symmetrical dispositional grounding's whole point is that CDF and CCF jointly, symmetrically produce the content with neither side solely responsible. All that is horn 3 of this trilemma that I proposed, wearing a plural noun. It only moves me to have to ask, does the relation as it actually obtains in the A configuration rather than the non-A configuration have that specific configuration necessarily or contingently? If necessarily, you're back in horn 1, now applied to the relation instead of the hexaity. If contingently, then what fixes that configuration rather than the other? If God's contribution alone fixes it, the joint or co-constitutive was just decorative, and it's just horn 2 all over again. If Peter's contribution to the relation is doing any of the fixing, then something not yet existing is partially responsible for determinate content in God's knowledge, and partial is enough here. Aseity doesn't require that a creature be the sole source of content in God to be violated. Aseity requires that God be the total source with nothing added from outside. A 50% creaturely contribution to fixing A rather than non-A is exactly as fatal as a 100% contribution. Joint grounding doesn't split the bullet, it just adds a second name to the same charge. If you want to ground, if you want to go to the ground of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom, that it's God's own intellect via super comprehension of Peter's essence, it's not his decree, and it's not creaturely contribution. That's a real move you can make. It is saying that God's infinite intellect so perfectly comprehends the possible essence Peter that this comprehension alone, prior to any divine will, yields determinate knowledge of what Peter would do, with nothing being received from Peter at all. And this sounds like it dodges my trilemma by putting the explanation entirely on God's side without being a divine decree. And here I'll press the same question I asked of exemplarism above. Is what super comprehension yields necessary or contingent given a necessarily existing possible essence and God's necessarily perfect intellect? If necessary, that's horn 1 of the trilemma again. Necessary content with no room for the contingency Molinism needs. If it is somehow contingent despite following from two necessary things comprehending each other, you owe an account of where the contingency enters, and if you can't supply one, super comprehension is just primitive, relocated into another form of technical vocabulary. The same move I've already caught with your use of hexaity, exemplar, disposition, and what was the fourth one? Primitive. So we can't slide the terms, we can't make them mean multiple things to accomplish whatever specific task we need in the moment that then ultimately makes that term contradict how we used it earlier. We need to be consistent in our model. We need to escape the trilemma. Thanks for watching. Looking forward to your reply.